Do you remember when a dime could buy you a ticket to another world? Before streaming services, before billion-dollar superhero franchises, there were simple paper treasures that captured the imaginations of an entire generation. This was the golden age of children's comic books from the 1950s and 60s. They didn't just offer adventure, they were cultural landmarks that shaped how we tell stories today. Whether you spent your childhood eagerly waiting for the next issue of Batman, wondering if those X-ray specs really worked, or were just curious about how today's Marvel blockbusters trace back to these humble beginnings, you're in for a treat. From controversial Senate hearings to campy TV adaptations, from sea monkeys to Superman, we're diving into a world that entertained millions and quietly revolutionized entertainment as we know it. Before video games, before streaming, before smartphones, there were comic books, affordable windows into worlds of wonder that fit right in your back pocket. These weren't just ink on paper, they were portals to different worlds, shaping the imaginations and values of an entire generation. These seemingly simple stories became cultural touchstones that continue to influence entertainment today. This is the story of how comics became king. The 1950s dawned on an America forever changed by World War II. The economy was booming, suburbs were sprouting like wildflowers, and families were settling into a new version of the American dream. With this prosperity came something precious for children, leisure time, and publishers were ready to capitalize on it. For just a dime, kids could escape into worlds more exciting than their own backyards. These comics weren't created in a vacuum. They reflected the optimism of the era while glossing over its tensions. The perfect nuclear family, the triumph of good over evil, these weren't just storytelling conventions, they were reflections of what America wanted to believe about itself during the Cold War. Comic books became a kind of comfort food for the American psyche. The landscape of children's comics was dominated by a handful of powerhouse publishers, each with their own distinctive approach. Dell Comics ruled the roost in the early 50s, pumping out titles featuring beloved Disney and Warner Brothers characters. They were the safe choice for parents, wholesome, predictable, and aligned with characters kids already knew from the silver screen. Then there was Harvey Comics, home to Casper the Friendly Ghost and Richie Rich, the poor little rich boy. Harvey specialized in characters that were cute, non-threatening, and endlessly merchandisable. They knew exactly what kids wanted and what parents would approve. And who could forget Archie Comics? While they started in the 40s, Archie and the gang at Riverdale High really hit their stride in the 50s and 60s. These weren't just comics. They were social guides, showing teens how to navigate the complicated world of soda shops and school dances. DC Comics, already home to Superman and Batman, created kid-friendly spin-offs like Superboy and Adventure Comics. Before they became the house of ideas we know today, Marvel was publishing titles like Millie the Model and Patsy Walker, comics aimed at young girls that were a far cry from the superhero renaissance to come. While their competitors were playing it safe, Marvel was quietly setting the stage for a revolution that would change comic books forever. The mid-50s brought a moral panic that nearly destroyed the comic book industry. Psychiatrist Frederick Wortham published Seduction of the Innocent, linking comics to juvenile delinquency. The controversy reached all the way to the United States Senate, where hearings were held to investigate the corrupting influence of comics on America's youth. Publishers watched in horror as their industry was painted as a menace to society. In response, publishers created the Comics Code Authority in 1954. This self-censoring body ensured that comics adhered to strict moral guidelines. No disrespect to authority figures, no excessive violence, no horror, no unwholesome romantic interest. For children's comics, this meant sanitized stories that reinforced traditional values. Gone were the edgier elements that had given comics their bite. In their place, morality tales where good always triumphed and lessons were learned. The code would shape children's comics for decades to come. Despite, or perhaps because of, these limitations, the 50s and 60s gave birth to some of the most beloved characters in comic book history. What made these characters stick? They were relatable. Whether it was Dennis the Menace getting into trouble or little Lulu outsmarting the boys, kids saw themselves in these stories. The art styles evolved too. Compare the detailed illustrations of the early 50s to the more simplified, animation-inspired look of the late 60s. Publishers discovered that cleaner lines and more expressive characters connected better with young readers. The storytelling became more sophisticated too. Writers began crafting narratives that could be enjoyed on multiple levels: slapstick humor for the kids, subtle references for older readers. It was a formula that would influence children's entertainment for generations to come. While superheroes get all the glory today, the reality is that children's comic books in the 50s and 60s covered a much broader spectrum. Mad Magazine, which started as a comic book before transitioning to a magazine format, taught an entire generation to question authority and look at the world with a skeptical eye. Its influence can't be overstated. Without Mad, there's no Saturday Night Live and no meme culture. Educational comics flourished too. Classics Illustrated made literature accessible to reluctant readers. Science comics explained complex concepts in ways textbooks never could. And let's not forget TV tie-in to comic books. As television became the dominant medium, comics featuring the Flintstones, the Jetsons, and other TV characters became a way for kids to take their favorite shows with them anywhere. Publishers were constantly looking for ways to make their products stand out. In 1953, the 3D comic craze hit America like a tidal wave. These required special glasses with red and blue lenses to create the illusion of depth. Sure, they gave you a headache if you read with them too long, but the novelty was irresistible. Though the fad was short-lived, most 3D comics were gone by 1954, they represent the industry's willingness to experiment with new formats. We also saw giveaway comics distributed at stores and gas stations, comics that came with records, and even comics that were designed to be cut up and assembled into toys. Publishers were pushing the boundaries of what a comic book could be. For many kids, the ads in comic books were almost as exciting as the stories themselves, each one promising adventure, excitement, or social acceptance, all for just a few dollars plus shipping and handling. Take sea monkeys, for instance. The ads showed these humanoid creatures with cute faces and distinct personalities. The reality? Brine shrimp. Tiny, barely visible brine shrimp that rarely lived more than a few days. But hey, the disappointment was part of growing up in the comic book era. But some products actually delivered on their promises. Chemistry sets really did let you conduct experiments. Model kits really did help you build miniature cars and planes. These products created lasting memories and, for some, sparked lifelong interest in science and craftsmanship. And then there were the notorious X-ray specs. No, they couldn't actually let you see through walls or clothes, as many hopeful kids imagined. They used a simple optical illusion created by a feather sandwiched between two pieces of cardboard. Perhaps the most important part of the comic book ad experience was the waiting. 4 to 6 weeks felt like an eternity when you were 9 years old. That anticipation, checking the mailbox day after day, was something special, a lesson in patience that today's kids rarely experience. The DNA of these 50s and 60s comics is everywhere in today's entertainment landscape. Sometimes, these adaptations captured a completely different tone from their source material, like the delightfully campy Batman TV series of the 1960s. Where the comics had been trending toward darker detective stories, the show embraced bright colors, over-the-top villains, and those iconic BAM text overlays. It was a reinvention that defined Batman for an entire generation of kids who might never have picked up a comic book. And let's not forget the blockbuster movie franchises based on children's superhero comic books. It's remarkable to think that today's multi-billion-dollar superhero movie empires trace their DNA back to these humble children's comics. DC's kid-friendly Superman and Batman titles from the 50s and 60s established these characters in the public consciousness decades before they dominated the box office. And Marvel's early offerings, even those predating their superhero renaissance, laid the foundational storytelling approach that would eventually revolutionize cinema. Those interconnected universes we now take for granted in movies, that all started with children passing comics between friends, discovering that Spider-Man could appear in the Fantastic Four's world. What began as a cost-saving publishing technique became the template for the most successful film franchise in history. The architects of these childhood universes could never have imagined their creations would one day command $100 million budgets and global audiences. Yet the simple stories they told, mixing relatable human problems with fantastic adventures, proved to be the perfect formula for entertaining not just kids of the 50s and 60s, but audiences of all ages well into the 21st century. The nostalgia for this era is so powerful that publishers and studios continue to reboot and reimagine these properties. They know that the emotional connection formed during childhood is a powerful thing, and they're banking on it. The children's comics of the 1950s and 60s were more than just entertainment. They were companions, teachers, and windows to possible worlds. Their influence extends far beyond the printed page. The filmmakers, writers, and artists who grew up reading these comics have shaped our modern entertainment landscape in their image. And while today's kids have countless entertainment options, there's something special about the intimate experience of reading a comic book. The way it engages the imagination, asking readers to fill in the gaps between panels, to hear the voices, to imagine the movement. These comics may be relics of a simpler time, but the joy they brought, and continue to bring, is timeless. Thanks for joining us on this journey through the golden age of children's comic books. Until next time, keep turning those pages.